Hi, I am Ms. Roz. Today we are going to start talking about the yeast unit. So I'm going to talk about some of the basics of yeast and also talk about two of the types of mixing methods. Right. So first off, fermentation. Right. This is when the yeast and the enzymes start to work together and they break down the carbohydrates within all the ingredients, and this is what we call fermentation. And they actually produce two byproducts. Right. So fermentation is the breakdown of the carbohydrates, right? And we're using the yeast to do this, and the enzymes that are found within the yeast, right? And they produce two byproducts. One is alcohol, okay, and this is going to be for flavor, right? However, the second one is going to be carbon dioxide, right? And if you remember from science class, CO2 is a gas, right? And this is going to be for the leavening agent. Okay? So you'll notice that bread tends to have a particular flavor to it, and that's because of the alcohol. Right? You will not get drunk off of your bread because you will be baking it. But then also the carbon dioxide is what helps to rise your bread, right? When we make yeast bread, it takes much longer than what we're used to when we did with the quick mix methods, right? With the quick mix, I was able to mix my ingredients, make a batter, and put it directly in the oven, and it would be done within a half hour, 45 minutes. However, with yeast bread, this is a little different because we need to let this carbon dioxide create more gas, right? And so that means that it's going to actually take closer to an hour to 3 hours to let your product rise before you can shape it and then put it in the oven to bake, right? So just keep that in mind that yeast breads do take a little bit longer, right? When we do make yeast breads, there are some key ingredients that we use to help with the production of our yeast breads. Right? One of the first ones is sugar. Right? So this could be in the form of granulated sugar, brown sugar, honey, maple syrup, agave, whatever it is. But this sugar that we use is helps to feed our yeast. Right? So in order for my yeast to grow and to create that carbon dioxide, I need it to feed it. And so the sugar is what the yeast feeds off of. However, we also have salt, and this is what is going to help control that yeast, right? So as that yeast is growing, feeding off the sugar, right? That salt that you add into into the ingredients is going to help make sure that the yeast doesn't grow out of control, right? And then you have flour and water, and what remember from when we did quick breads and cookies and all those kinds of things is that flour plus water or any kind of liquid makes gluten. Okay, and so in yeast products, right, we want to develop a lot of gluten. All right, and then what happens is that the gluten tends to help trap that carbon dioxide gas, which helps then leaven your ingredients. Okay, or leaven your bread, I should say. Right, so that's kind of the basics of yeast bread for right now. Right, we're going to talk about two types of mixing methods. Right, we have what we call the conventional method, and then we have the quick mix method. You can make any yeast breads using either method, but there are some kind of advantages to one versus the other. Right, so in my conventional method, right, we are going to first dissolve the yeast that we have into water. Right? And typically this water should be at a temperature of about 105 to 110 degrees. Right? And this is what we call proofing. Right? You are proofing the yeast. Right? The advantage to doing the conventional method is to find out and make sure that your yeast is working. Right? So in this conventional proofing method, I put that yeast into the water and let it grow, and so I know that that yeast is actually working, right? So if you have older yeast and you're not sure if it's still good, this is a good way to go, right? But after that, right, I'm going to heat any other kinds of liquids I have, right? So maybe it might be egg, butter, milk, whatever, and then I'm going to add it in with my dissolved yeast, my proofed yeast, right? And then I'm going to, like I just said, mix it with the yeast, right? And once that's all together, and then I'm going to, the last thing I need to do is add the flour, right? And this is going to be based on the recipe, right? So depending on what your recipe says, it may say to, you might have a soft dough or what we call a stiff dough, meaning it's very hard to work with, or soft dough, which is very, what we call pliable, very flexible, right? So this is the conventional method, right? Which is really the proofing, okay? However, we also have the quick mix method, right? So what you would first do is you would mix all your dry ingredients together. Right, so my dry ingredients may be sugar, flour, salt, yeast. Any of those ingredients would all go into one bowl, right? And then I'm going to heat, right, my liquid ingredients, right? And this time with my heating, I can actually heat it somewhere between 100 and I say somewhere between 115 and 125 degrees, right? You'll notice that in the quick mix method, it is higher than in the conventional method, right? I'm gonna come back to that, and I'll have you kind of think about why do you think in the quick mix method my temperature is higher than if it were in the conventional method, right? So as I'm going over this, you can continue to think about it, and we'll talk a little more about specifically why, right? And then I'm going to add my flour and mix, okay? And then the last thing is just going to be add additional flour if needed, right? Again, based on the recipe. If needed, based on the recipe. Okay. So like I said, when we were doing this, right, in my conventional method, I proof my yeast first. However, in my quick mix method, I don't actually proof my yeast. We will find this out if it works when we let the dough rise, right? So one of the reasons that your ingredient or your liquid is on a lower temperature is because I'm allowing that yeast to be in the water directly, right? There's nothing surrounding that yeast to help protect it, so the temperature needs to be slightly lower. However, if I'm doing the quick mix method, right, because it's mixed in with the flour, the sugar, the salt, and other things, that temperature of 115 to 125 can be slightly higher since your yeast is a little more protected, right? So I'm going to start the demonstration on the recipes, and then we'll come back a little later and talk a little more about kneading. Hi, I'm Miss Roz. Today we are going to be making bagels. I will specifically go over all the ingredients. However, I do want to get my yeast proofing. So I do want to just talk real quick about what to add in order to do that. Right. So I have some water. Right. I have about 1 1/4 cup of warm water. It says or cool water. It says 80 degrees. And then I also need to add about a tablespoon of honey. So it said to divide the honey up. So you're going to use half the honey for this recipe right now, and then you're going to use half the honey for tomorrow's recipe, part of the recipe, right? And then a little yeast goes in there, right? And then I'm just going to mix that around a little, right, so that it can feed on itself and do its job and proof. Right, and then as I wait for that to proof, right, I'm going to put that to the side and we'll talk about all the other ingredients, right? So like I said, we need 1 1/4 cup of kind of cool water. It's at about 80 degrees. So in my liquid measuring cup, I put, that was room temperature water, and so I put that into the microwave for about 30 to 40 seconds just to kind of warm it up just a smidge, right? So it should feel kind of like tepid, kind of very kind of like cool bath water, right? And then I added about a tablespoon worth of honey. Here I have 2 tablespoons. I'm going to need that other tablespoon of honey for when I go to cook and boil my bagels. So in the recipe it does say 2 tablespoons of honey divided. So while you're making the dough you only need 1 tablespoon, and then tomorrow you'll need the second tablespoon. And then I also had put in the yeast, which was 2 teaspoons of yeast. If you bought the little packets, it's just 1 packet. 1 packet is about 2.25 teaspoons of yeast. And so I'm going to let that proof. I also need 1 egg, but this egg is actually not until the next day. This is what we'll use to what we call egg wash the bagels. You don't actually need this until day 2. Okay. However, you will need the salt. Okay. And then you'll also need, so this is 2 teaspoons of some salt, and I also need about 4 tablespoons of some flour. And then the other thing that you're going to need for tomorrow, or day 2, is going to be baking soda. So this is about a tablespoon of baking soda. So the things you'll need for tomorrow will be baking soda, the egg, and then the remainder of that 1 tablespoon of honey. All right. And then today, the other ingredients I need are the flour, the salt, and that's it. Okay. So I'm gonna wait for this to proof a little more, and I will come back with it once it's proofed, and then we can start working on the bagel dough. Hi. Okay. So we're waiting for our yeast to proof. And while I'm finishing up waiting on that, I'm going to just talk real quick about some of the attachments. I am going to use my stand mixer, which we haven't actually used in class, but because it just makes it a lot easier to mix your doughs, right? With my stand mixer, I actually have 2 attachments. If you have the KitchenAid, it's going to be 1 attachment. You might have a Cuisinart or some other type of brand. So just kind of have to pay attention to which one you have. So the most common attachments are these ones. It's also kind of considered the paddle with the KitchenAid. I like these to make brownies, cakes, cookies, things like that. So this is typically what I would use these for. But then you also have the whisks. So if I wanted to whisk up heavy cream to make whipped cream, or egg whites, or add a lot of air to it, I would use my whisks. Your attachment on the KitchenAid is kind of like, it looks kind of like a triangle, and it's kind of round. It's like big and round. That's the whisk. And then the last one are the dough hooks. Right, on the KitchenAid, again, you only have 1 dough hook. On mine, I have 2. Right, so these are my dough hooks. This is what I'm going to use to make yeast dough with, hence the term dough hook. But I actually like to start out when I'm making yeast breads with my regular attachments, because it helps to smooth out and kind of create a good base for my my ingredient, or for my dough, right? Right, so if you look at the yeast here, you can see that it's nice and foamy. That means that it's working, right? If you remember me talking about in the lecture, one of the advantages of using the conventional method is to know that your yeast is good to go. So if you have old yeast and you're not sure, this is definitely the way you want to go, because you don't want to use all those ingredients to come find out that the yeast doesn't actually work. Okay, so in this recipe, right, I've added the majority of my ingredients, but what I am going to do now is I'm going to add my flour. I do like to start off using my regular attachments just until my dough comes together a little. I like to make sure that it's nice and smooth, the base is smooth. So what I'll do is I'm going to just going to add about a scoop or so worth of flour just to get this going. So I'm going to put this down, make sure it locks in. Make sure your base here is also nice and tight and locked in as well before you start. And then I'm just going to turn this on and mix. Okay, and once that starts coming together, I'm going to add a little more flour. Now, for that water, okay, this recipe specifically says to have some cool water, so 80 to 90 degrees, but typically in a conventional method, your water would be a little warmer, somewhere around 105, 110. The reason that this is a little lighter, or I'm sorry, a little lower in temperature is because we're doing a slow rise. Later on, you'll see normally when you make yeast breads, you make the dough, you let it rise, right? We punch it down and release all that carbon dioxide. We shape our dough, right, into whatever we're making, and then we let it rise a second time. However, with these bagels, we're actually only letting it rise once, but that rise is going to take between 12 and 18 hours, right? So ideally, the best time to make this is in the evening, okay? Make all your dough. So what will happen is we'll make all the dough, shape it, right? And then let it go, cover it, put it in the refrigerator, and then it'll rise overnight for about 12 to 18 hours. And then in the morning, you can then cook your bagels and then cook and bake them, boil and bake them. So just to keep that in mind in terms of time management. But one of the things about the temperature is very important when it comes to yeast, right? If your water is not warm enough, so the temperature needs to be somewhere at minimum around 70 to 80 degrees to kind of activate that yeast. If it's too cold, it won't do anything and it won't activate, right? And so then your dough won't rise, right? If it's too hot, right? So if it's above like 120, you're going to kill your yeast, and then again, it's not going to rise, right? So keep that in mind as well, right? So I added a little more flour. One of the safety things about using your stand mixer is to make sure that you turn this off before you use a rubber scraper to scrape down the sides. Please do not put your rubber scraper in to the mixer while it is still moving. Okay, so let's add a little more. All right, so now that my dough is kind of it kind of looks like a cake batter, right? I don't want to get it too stiff, right? Before I change out into my dough hooks, right? So once this kind of stops being like you get kind of to the cake batter stage here, where it's still nice and liquidy, right? I'm going to take these off. I like to use these first just to kind of make sure that all of my wet ingredients get combined in there. And it also helps to kind of make sure that the base of my dough is nice and smooth, right? So I'm going to just kind of getting rid of the rest of the dough off of my hooks here, off of my beaters. All right. And then I'm going to change over to the dough hooks and add the rest of this. Now, this is going to be a nice stiff dough. So as it's mixing, it might look kind of what we call shaggy, meaning it's kind of dry and it doesn't seem to be coming together. But if you let it knead more, right, mix more, it will come together, okay? So don't be too worried about the fact that it looks a little dry. Now, if you're doing this by hand, it's going to take you a little while, right? The recipe tells you that you should knead for 15 to 20 minutes. So what might happen is you might knead for a little while and you might have to stop and then come back to it a couple minutes later, or maybe you have somebody else help you knead it. If you have like a younger brother or sister, you can help teach them how to make bagels as well. All right, so I'm going to close this up again. All right, I'm going to add a little more flour, all right, and then let it mix some more. All right, now also keep in mind, I haven't added the flour, so I can add the flour kind of now, where I like to make the dough a little before, the salt. I like to make the dough and get it together, and then I'll add that salt. So I'm going to add it now as the dough starts to come together. But also keep in mind that dough can be very what we call temperamental, right? It really is based upon kind of the environment that you're in, right? So if it's very wet, very moist, kind of in the atmosphere, in your environment, right, you probably are going to need more flour than if it was very dry, right? So today, as I'm making it, it rained most of the day, so there's going to be a lot of moisture in the air. So I'm probably going to use all 4.5 cups of flour, or 4 cups of flour. However, right, if it's a really dry day, I live in Arizona, or it's the middle of the summer, I might need to use less flour. Because there's not so much moisture in the air. This is really kind of dependent on the weather, what your home environment is like, if you have a humidifier and things like that. So kind of have to just look and see what your dough looks like. And so we'll look at it again once it's all mixed together. But I will return in about 10 minutes or so, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this mixed together, and then I'm actually going to knead it in my bowl, in my stand mixer. So I can just let it go and let it mix for 10 to 15 minutes so that it's nice and that gluten is nice and developed, right? And then we'll talk about hand kneading when we come back, because I always do hand knead all of my dough, even if I do use a stand mixer, right? So I will return in about 10 to 15 minutes and see you then. All right, welcome back from kneading in your mixer, if you were doing that. Now we're going to talk about how to do this by hand. I will say that if you are doing the whole thing by hand, that it does take a little while to do this, okay? So your dough is going to be very stiff, all right? This is my dough right here. I am going to put a little flour down. It probably is not going to be super sticky because, like I said, it's going to be a stiff dough. But put a little flour down just in case so it doesn't stick down to the counter. All right. And then take your dough, and what you're going to do is you're going to kind of stretch it, fold it, and then press it down, right? And then kind of continue that a few times. I do like to knead by hand just a little, even if I use the mixer, just because I like to kind of make sure that I kind of get a feel for what the dough feels like. Like I said, it should be kind of stiff. It should be, hard to work with, I guess. But it also helps me to kind of incorporate and make sure all of those ingredients are nice and together. All right, so as you can see, I kind of shift it around, turn it, fold it, and then continue to knead it. Like I said, it's going to be very stiff and kind of hard to work with. All right. Okay. And then after you knead it for a little while, we're going to actually divide this into 8 pieces. So you could get a scale if you had one, if you wanted to be more accurate. However, I'm just going to use a butter knife to help kind of divide this out into 8 pieces. And we're just going to kind of estimate what it feels like. All right, so once I'm kind of done kneading this, you can also tell when you're done. You can do what we do call a window pane method. So you can actually take a little of your dough here, and you can kind of stretch it. Maybe I need to knead this a little more. Right? And you should be able to stretch it, right? And as you stretch it, be able to kind of see through the window pane of your dough without it breaking, right? That means that that gluten, that protein is really kind of really done its job, right? And created that window pane. So actually, I think I'm going to need this a little more. It seems like it needs to be kneaded a little more, right? But this dough makes about 8 bagels, right? And like I said, you're going to let this rise overnight, so it needs to rise for 12 to 18 hours. So please make sure you do time management and pay attention to how much time you need in order to make these bagels, right? So let's kind of I'm just going to take a butter knife here, and I'm going to take my dough, and I want 8 pieces, so I'm going to just cut my dough in half here. You could also use a bench knife if you have one. Mine, unfortunately, is already in the dishwasher, but a butter knife works just as well. All right, so I have 2 pieces here now, and so if I cut these 2 pieces in half, I then end up with 4 pieces. Right, and then with those 4 pieces, right, I'm going to just kind of, just want to make sure that when I cut these in half that they are equal in size. Right, so actually just kind of roll them into a dough ball. Hopefully your dough balls now are about the same size, so that when you go to divide these one more time, they are again about the same size. Like I said, you can use a scale if you really want to make it a little more accurate. That's perfectly fine. I'm okay with my bagels being slightly different in size. All right. Okay. So 8 dough balls. There we go. All right, so 8 of these. So what you're going to do now is you're going to roll these into balls, but then we have to put in that signature hole right in the middle, right? So roll these into a ball, okay, best that you can, right? And then you're actually just take your thumb, right, and your forefinger and just pinch a hole right in the middle, right? And then just kind of wring it out. Right. And it's okay if the hole to your bagel is a little bigger, because what will happen is that it's going to rise, and so you kind of need to have that hole will close up a little when you do this, like when they go to rise, right? So 8 of these, right? And then I will cover this with some saran wrap, just loosely. The recipe says to tent it with some tin foil. I'm actually going to just put a little saran wrap on it because I don't want them to get all dried out. Right? Hope this one's not. Right? Make sure your ball is a good ball before you start trying to put a hole in the middle, or it's going to all come apart. All right? So roll it into that ball. Use your fingers, your 2 fingers, and just pinch a hole in the middle. There we go. That's better. All right, and then I'm just going to stretch out my bagel a little, like so. Okay, so you, like I said, do this to all 8 of these, and then just kind of cover it with a little saran wrap. It doesn't need to be tight saran wrap, because, you know, if you remember from the lecture, there's going to be some carbon dioxide that is created, so there will be some gas, and that saran wrap will kind of expand a little as it rises. Right? So I'm making this evening, and then I will let these sit overnight, right? And then tomorrow morning we'll come back and I'll show you how to boil them and bake them. And if you want to add any like toppings onto it, you can also do it at that time, right? So just continue to shape these into bagels, and then you're good to go. Right, so I will see you in the AM to cook these off, and these will hopefully expand and look like bagels. Right, so it was good to see you, and I'll see you in the morning. Have a nice evening. Hi. Actually, we're going to talk real quick about cleaning up while you're waiting for your dough to rise. If you were kneading on the counter, and we did talk about this briefly in when we made scones, but I just wanted to talk real quick about it here again. So you can't really tell, unfortunately, on my counter because it is white, and obviously flour is white as well. But you'll notice when you're doing it that your counter tends to get a little stuck with flour. So you want to make sure that you clean off the flour first before you add any liquid, right? So I use my bench knife. Sometimes I can also use, I have just like a little this I can also use to scrape, but either way, whether you have a utensil that you can use or not, be sure to scrape off all the dry bits from your counter first before you wipe it down, all right? Once you add that water, it tends to get kind of stuck to the counter, so you want to make sure that you get all that flour up as much as possible before adding any water. Good morning and welcome back. We are ready to boil and bake our bagels. So these are what my bagels look like now the next morning. They have puffed up, and so now we are going to boil them. The recipe says to do 1.5 gallons. Keep in mind 16 cups is a gallon, so you're going to need about 24 cups worth of water. So you want a big kind of stock pot. I have this one right here. You can see the water boiling. I have added a tablespoon of honey and a tablespoon of baking soda, right? And then what I also am going to use is a slotted spoon because I want to make sure that that water, goes through and I'm not carrying lots of water when I take out my bagels, right? So what I want to do is I am going to take my bagel, right, and carefully put it in, and I'm going to let it boil for about 20 seconds. You can do 2, maybe 3, depending on how big your pot is. My pot is kind of wide, so I have a little more room to do it. But if you kind of have one of those more narrow, tall pots, maybe you only do 2 at a time. All right, so I'm gonna just boil those for somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds on each side. So let it boil, and then you're gonna just use the slotted spoon to turn them over, and then take them out and then put them directly onto your pan. Right, so I think I've talked for about 30 seconds. I'm just going to turn those over. So they should kind of turn a little kind of brown, like kind of a more beigey color. Right, and then I also am going to need 1 egg. That 1 egg is going to be, I'm going to do it what we call an egg wash on top of the bagels, and that's kind of what helps give that pretty like kind of dark brown kind of color to my bagels. Right, so I'm going to take these bagels out, right, and again make sure you kind of get all that liquid out before you take them, before you put them on the pan. Right, and then do these in batches. And so while I'm waiting for these to finish up and cook, or boil I should say, I'm going to break open my egg and prepare that egg wash. There we go. Right. And then if you have a brush, this really helps to be able to egg wash. So it doesn't, even if you just have like a unused paintbrush, that works as well. But I do have a pastry brush that I will be using. It looks just like a paintbrush. Okay. So mine looks like, I'm actually use my little one that looks like this. Then we're going to turn these guys over. You can even see them kind of puff up a little as they're boiling, which is kind of cool to watch. Alright, and then you could do these plain if you wanted, but if you have some seasonings that you want to put on top, you're more than welcome to. So I have this everything but the bagel, so if you have this you could use it. If you don't, you could also make your own everything bagel mix, so it's kind of some poppy seeds, sesame seeds, garlic, minced onions, salt, kind of whatever you feel like putting in there. So typically they'll say do about a tablespoon or 2 of each of those for your mix, right? So as I wait for this, right, I'm going to brush my eggs with my brush my bagels with my egg wash. like so, right? And then if you're gonna put any toppings on, you want to be sure to put the egg wash on first, and then the toppings. If you don't do the egg, that's perfectly fine. But I do find that it gives that nice brown kind of color to that bagel and gives that crispiness that we like in a traditional bagel. Right? But put the egg wash on first before the topping, if that's how you're choosing to do this. Right? I also preheated my oven to 450 degrees. Yes, it is very hot because that helps to kind of really make that crispiness on the outside of your bagels. All right. All right. So I am actually going to take these out, but I am going to when I let them rise overnight, I had them all on the same pan, but that looks like because they've expanded now, I'm going to actually let them be separate so that they don't overcrowd one another. So I'm actually going to put 4 and 4 just in case. I want to make sure that they don't expand into one another. All right, so like I said, egg wash them and then put your everything, whatever topping you want on here. All right. Egg wash. So I'm just going to spread these out a little. Hopefully you can see. Right, and then just take my, apparently I haven't used this yet. And then just sprinkle it on, and then you're going to bake these for approximately, it says, let's see, 12 to 18 minutes, okay? So again, always start out with the lowest number, and then if you need to, you can add. All right, so let's just sprinkle a little of this everything on here. I'm going to do half and half. My husband loves everything bagels, so I'll do half everything and half plain because I'm not a huge fan of the everything bagel. All right, so what I'll do is I'm going to finish topping these off, and then I'm going to put them in the oven, bake them for 12 minutes, and then I will see you back here to see how they turn out. All right, see you in a little bit.